Oftentimes when you ask somebody what their favorite Spider-Man game is, you'll get a few different answers. Spider-Man PS4, Spider-Man 2, Maximum Carnage, Amazing Spider-Man 2. I can't even say that with a straight face. But I personally remember a time not too long ago when most fans online would say that Shaba Games' Web of Shadows was at the top of their list. It was 2008, so I was still playing Spider-Man 3 on the PS2. Then, by the time I got a 360 and was buying my own games, Activision lost the rights and then the secondary market took over. So after looking both far and wide for a copy that won't make me bankrupt, I have my own copy of Web of Shadows. So let's finally play through this game and see if it's as good as people said it was. First off, this is an ugly game. Don't get me wrong, New York itself looks fantastic. The buildings are detailed, the skyboxes look great. All in all, it's a definite step up over Spider-Man 3, which was released a year beforehand. But the characters look wrong. Whether it's Kingpin or Luke Cage's faces, the gang leader's hands, the animation during cutscenes, it's all rough and awkward. Don't even get me fucking started on the performance issues. For the first 5 or so hours of the game, there weren't too many frame rate drops or screen tearing. It was present, but I've had much worse experiences on 7th gen consoles. At least that was the case until the third act happened, where all hell broke loose. The closer and closer I got to the ending, the game would just slow down, like I was playing it in a shitty emulator. Can't forget about the pop-in either. I also constantly had glitches, like symbiotes getting stuck inside of buildings during combat, which kind of makes it a pain in the ass to, finish the game. It's still fine looking overall. It's just a shame how this game's performance is not great on console. But once you get past the performance issues, there's the story, which is probably the most contentious part of this game. That is, if contentious means shit. The first thing you see is Spider-Man walking dramatically to Moonlight Sonata as the city falls apart all around him. And believe me, it definitely feels like a late 2000s AMV. But then the story flashes back 3 weeks ago, meaning that this entire story is in medias res. Basically, Venom has been reproducing at a rapid rate, infecting all of the people in New York and turning them into these monsters, including characters surrounding Spider-Man. After a lot of fetch quests, eventually S.H.I.E.L.D., Kingpin, Vulture, the Tinkerer, Wolverine, and Spider-Man all come together to build a machine to get rid of the symbiotes without killing the hosts. Luke Cage is in the game, he just doesn't do shit beyond the first hour or so. He shows up at points with Mary Jane, but even then, he just kinda stands there, menacingly. At the end of the game, Spider-Man confronts Venom, leading to Eddie Brock having a change of heart and taking his own life. Depending on your choices throughout the game, you can get rid of the symbiotes and save the world, or you can rule over the city. There are some slight differences depending on if you went with Mary Jane or Black Cat. If you get the black suit ending, there's an after-credit scene where all your homies hire symbiote Wolverine to go kick your ass. And yeah, that's the campaign. It's fine. The most glaring issue would be the amount of campiness, and not fun camp like the Raimi trilogy, or innocent camp like the 60s animated series. It's more like a cringy lack of self-awareness. As you could probably tell by my synopsis and the footage you're seeing on screen, the game takes itself very, very seriously. And while I appreciate that the story tries to play it straight, there's just this constant feeling of the writers trying too hard, which just makes the awkward stuff stand out even more, like, say, Spider-Man's portrayal. His writing is spot on. The quips are funny and obnoxious. His interactions with characters feel accurate. I do wish he was a little more serious at times, but for the most part, this is a great Spider-Man. However, the voice acting by Mike Vaughn just doesn't really mesh well with the character. It also doesn't help that, after that super serious cutscene, this is his first line of dialogue.
Where's Cage and his search party? The civilian volunteers! Pretty redhead, arm and a cast! You are no help!
The biggest issue for me is that there's a lot of, frankly, needless setup in order to get to the meat of the story. Setup and world building are completely fine. The problem is that it feels completely disconnected from everything, and not in a fun way. I get what Shaba Games was going for. They made the beginning of the game feel like a standard Spider-Man affair, setting up the groundwork before revealing what the story is really about. It allows us to become somewhat invested in what happens to these characters. But the fact of the matter is that the crime war involving Kingpin isn't captivating in the slightest, and the third act is a completely different can of worms. Part of me wanted to play the game twice in order to see if the evil playthrough was any different. However, all the black suit stuff doesn't feel in line with Spider-Man whatsoever. I get that the symbiote interferes with his thought process and makes him quick to anger. I also understand that this entire story is filled with the symbiote causing characters to act out of pocket. But, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think Spider-Man would let gangs finish each other off, rip Wolverine in half, or murder Eddie Brock in any world. Speaking of which, Venom's death at the end of the game, while iconic, doesn't really feel earned. I get that it's a superhero game and we're here for, Spider-Man, but Venom only shows up in 3 missions, including the ending where he commits said seppuku. Maybe Shaba was strategically using Venom sparingly to make those missions count more, since this was the 3rd Spider-Man game in a 4-year period that was centered around Venom. Regardless of that shit, Venom should have had more of a presence in the game, especially in a game that's all about him. Casual sexism. Nice. The one thing I could say about Web of Shadows is that it definitely feels distinct from all the other Spider-Man games. Instead of just making a game based on the characters solely for financial reasons, there was definitely an artistic vision behind Web of Shadows. It takes the idea of symbiotes taking over New York and explores every interesting facet of that concept. Symbiote versions of Spider-Man villains, heroes and villains working together to save the world, Peter having an internal battle that the player gets to control. It's all an interesting take on the damage that the symbiote can do if it ever wanted to, and the open world does a damn good job of supporting this story. During the opening hours, the skybox is bright and the world feels lively. Even when there is crime going on, it feels very mundane, only for the entire city to eventually devolve into chaos. Once the symbiote takes over and the city goes to shit, the game never stops conveying that through the open world. The skyscrapers are covered with symbiote tendrils and pods. People trying to escape in their cars are chased down by symbiotes like rabid dogs. SHIELD teams you try to save become infected, forcing you to put them out of their misery. Civilians try to arm themselves with guns, only for them to be ineffective against the swarm of symbiotes. As much as I can criticize the tone, writing, voice acting, glitches, I can respect the vision behind Web of Shadows and the amount of work that went into it. And the same goes with the gameplay. At its core, it's the exact same loop that was established all the way back in Spider-Man 2. Web swinging around the open world, random crimes to stop, innocent people to save, lots of combat with faceless thugs, and boss fights. The difference this time around is how the systems function. Web swinging has always had the same general structure where the player can either focus on speed or verticality, but it's always felt different in each game. And Web of Shadows feels a lot more free and open, which makes the chases a lot more fun than they should be. Spider-Man feels airy and nimble, allowing him to swing as fast or as high as he needs to. The ability to run, web zip, and slide on any wall you choose should be in every fucking Spider-Man game. The only criticism I can really think of is that the web zip puts a stop to your momentum when it really shouldn't, but even then, it's not that big of a deal. Combat is a massive improvement, with a surprising amount of variation in the moves that you can purchase. It makes the beginning of the game and the end look like night and day. The web strike mechanic has lots of variations this time around, including throwing your target. Air combat is more fleshed out, and now there's wall combat, which is one of the new big mechanics Web of Shadows is proud of, and rightfully so. The camera is a bit shit, but overall, it still works really well. The timer preventing overuse of the black suit from Spider-Man 3 is gone this time around, allowing the player to switch between the red and black suits as often as they please, which adds an extra layer to the combat since each suit has their own advantages. Specifically, the black suit is way stronger and can do things like throw cars or tackle enemies to the ground. Collecting spider symbols around New York upgrades your swing speed, while combat gives you XP for brand new moves, keeping the swinging and combat upgrades separate. You also have to upgrade each suit individually, which prevents the player from becoming too overpowered too soon. There is a counter mechanic, but I never used it once. I didn't even use the block, evade, or specials either until the very end of the game when the symbiotes begin to bombard you. Even then, the game is so brain dead easy. And that's honestly thanks to how shit the AI is. The friends you can call in to help with battle, like Wolverine, Moon Knight, or Vulture, do quite literally, may I add, jack shit. I cannot fucking count how many times Rhino got stuck in the walls during the prison break, meaning that I had to reset the entire game since there isn't an option to reload a checkpoint. Saving citizens was a massive headache, since the button that you use to lock on and save a civilian is the same button you use to web shoot an enemy. Once a blue moon, it worked the first time, but majority of my playthrough trying to save civilians during combat became a battle against the camera and the controls, a battle that I almost always lost. As I mentioned earlier, the camera is incredibly disorienting, specifically during air and wall combat. So like 40% of the game. The boss fights are fun, but they aren't allowed to shine as much as they should. They're just punching bags with shitty QTEs at the end. Not to mention that every single boss fight is copied and pasted for the second half of the game. The quick time events, oh god, I haven't even talked about the quick time events. I don't make it a secret on my channel that I don't really like these, especially when they're forced. QTEs are cinematic moments that you press a button for. Most of the time, it's pretty harmless. Even when I don't like them, a well-animated QTE is at least something good to look at. The linchpin for a good QTE is that it needs to be animated well in order to keep the player immersed. And Web of Shadows did not do that. The campaign from beginning to end is about 10 hours long, and I feel very comfortable saying that it should have been half that length. The last 3 hours of the game become a smorgasbord of escort missions with boss fights sprinkled in between that you've already completed earlier in the game. The entire thing is structured around doing fetch quests for various characters like Moon Knight, Black Widow, and Kingpin. Most of these missions are fun, that's with an asterisk, because like any other Spider-Man game, there's occasional bullshit, like an entire mission about deactivating generators only to have to go back and reactivate them yourself, just bloating the runtime. But honestly, that's what the entire third act is. It's solely comprised of the exact same missions that we've already done for the first 6 or so hours of the game. Beat X amount of this enemy, save X amount of civilians, etc, etc. With the only addition being escort missions. My least favorite things in video games. What the fuck was that? My least favorite thing in video games besides forced stealth. Thankfully, the combat is so good that the repetitive missions don't ruin the game, but it was still enough to make me want the game to be over already. By like the symbiote Black Cat fight, I'd already mentally checked out well before that. Besides combat, the other big selling point of Web of Shadows is the aforementioned alignment meter. Where it goes depends on your choices throughout the story, as well as your actions in the open world, but it's mostly just the story choices. What makes it a little more interesting is that you can call in other characters to assist you, but who you have access to depends on your alignment. In concept, it's very much a proto-Infamous. However, I want to talk about the Black Point system, which is a terrible name, by the way. Depending on what you do or don't do, Black Points can rack up very, very quickly. Like the mission where the game tells you to throw cars at the mechs, but each time you throw a car, it adds 2 black points. Or when, say, a civilian is falling, you only have seconds to save them, and when you inevitably fail to catch them because the controls are fucked, it adds 10 black points. I'll talk about this a little more in an eventual video on Amazing Spider-Man 2 in 2075. But in regards to Web of Shadows, I get that the game could be going for the angle of how difficult it is to actually be Spider-Man. To even get close to the mantle, you have to be infallible and save everyone. When compared to Peter Parker, we're all so imperfect, despite how flawed he is himself. And in order to fit the construct of what Spider-Man should be, you need to achieve his level of morality. However, that doesn't make for a fun video game, at least the way it's done here. I say all this, and yet the black points become extremely superfluous since the story choices overwrite anything you do in the open world. Who could forget the Wolverine fight, where you're asked arbitrary trivia about the character and that affects the red and black meter? You have no clue the amount it takes it took for me to get that line done. It's a very, very interesting idea, and I'm glad that it's here. But the usage of the red-black meter feels like a lazy way to make the mechanic matter more than it does. Its inclusion is ultimately inconsequential since it only affects the cutscene after the fight. Spider-Man, who was in Paris. As interesting as the alignment meter is, the way it's implemented is underwhelming. It all really boils down to either being Spider-Man or a 13-year-old edgelord.
And God help anyone who disrespected the Queen.
Before I finish, let's take a quick detour. Much like every other Activision game, Web of Shadows was released on as many consoles as possible. It ended up having 3 distinct games by different developers. The one this video is focused on is a version released on 360, PS3, and PC, which was developed by Shaba Games. The PS2 and PSP got a 2.5D side-scroller developed by Amaze Entertainment, which is weird when you consider that for Spider-Man 3, the exact same game was released on PS2, Wii, and PSP, and the DS release is a Metroidvania developed by Kryptonite Games. However, I lied. I told a fib. There's a secret 4th game, that being the Wii release, which was also developed by Shaba Games. It's pretty much the same game as the PC and 7th Gen releases, just a bit different. The first thing you'll notice is that it's very dialed back visually, but I'm not too bothered by it. I grew up with a PS2 and a Wii until the 8th fucking grade, so this is just what games looked like to me for a very long time. The biggest difference, however, is the controls. It's an Activision published Wii title, so there's no classic controller support, which will come back to bite this game in the ass, because there aren't enough buttons, leading to most of the game being motions with the Wiimote and nunchuck. Web swinging, web strikes, QTEs, all motion controlled. That sniper section almost made my damn arm fall off. There's also some odd changes, like the Black Cat chase through the city being completely omitted from the game entirely. It just plays the cutscenes and jumps to her boss fight for some reason. The cutscenes are also video files instead of being an engine like in the HD version, which is completely understandable. However, since Web of Shadows on the Wii is smaller than on the 360, the video files are extremely compressed, but the most notable difference with the Wii version is the interchangeable costumes. Much like Spider-Man 2 and 3, you can't change into any other suits in Web of Shadows, at least in the HD releases. The Wii only has 6 suits, and most of them are geared towards 90s fans, like Spider Carnage, Spider Armor, Iron Spider, and Cosmic Spider-Man. Slim pickings, yeah, but it's a lot better than nothing. So, is it worth playing the Wii release of Web of Shadows just for the alternate costumes? No, not at all. But it's still a pretty solid version of the game, albeit with some weird caveats. It's a surprisingly good alternative to forking over $80. I guess you could say it's a pretty good Wii lease.
Here's to the ones that we got. Cheers to the wish you were here, but you're not, 'cause the drinks bring back all the memories.
Of course, there's still the Amazing Allies edition and the DS release. One day I'll play those. I'ma be honest, today is not that day. We've talked about the game ad nauseum, so now let's talk about the aftermath. This game was developed by Shaba Games as well as Spider-Man veteran Treyarch. However, Treyarch was only given credit because it was their engine for Spider-Man 3. Shaba began in the late 90s as a small crew of devs from Crystal Dynamics, specifically the team that made Pandemonium 2 for the PS1. Haven't played it, so you just gotta have to imagine what that game looks like. They did such a good job on Pro Skater 3 that Activision acquired them. They made a couple more Tony Hawk games, a couple Shrek games, a terrible wakeboarding game, and then were assigned with Web of Shadows. And it underperformed. Critics didn't care for it whatsoever, and it didn't sell well. It couldn't even make the sales chart for October 2008. Shaba Games wanted to make a sequel that was based on iconic battles from the comics, sort of like the greatest hits of Spider-Man's career. The game would forego the open world for being level-based, something that at the time hadn't been done on home consoles since Spider-Man 2 for the PSP. The title was Spider-Man Classic, and all that survived is this concept art, because despite achieving cult status amongst Spider-Man fans online, the writing was on the wall. Activision shut down Shaba Games and gave an alternate version of the idea for the sequel to Beanox, which gave us 2010's Shattered Dimensions. And you all know how that story ended. Ultimately, like many other studios under Activision's reign, Shaba's bright future was destroyed by the very company that led them down that dark path. Web of Shadows was the last Spider-Man game on the PS2, and would be the last open-world game until The Amazing Spider-Man in 2012, which was also developed by Beanox. Is Web of Shadows good? Is it bad? Frankly, it's a little bit of both. The game was built on an already shit engine. The dialogue and story often come off as writers trying too hard to make Spider-Man cool, without just letting him naturally be cool, which makes the already underutilized alignment meter matter even less. But when Web of Shadows does something right, it's damn near amazing. The web swinging, the combat, the look of an infected New York, it's all great. It took an interesting concept and did it to the best of their ability. But the rest of the game feels either too scared to go outside of its comfort zone, or wasn't given near enough attention and direction to make it live up to its potential. And that's the most frustrating thing here. Web of Shadows and the canceled Spider-Man Classic had immense potential. And to me, that's the reason why everybody puts up with this game's bullshit, because believe me, there is bullshit. Under that rough exterior, there's also something more, a glitter of something that could have lived up to the trailers. As is, Web of Shadows was a fine game that tried to take the character and his formula into a new direction, but didn't quite take it to the next level. And with that, I'm done. This is the biggest video I made in a very long time. It took way longer than I wanted it to take, but I'm glad that I did it. I made this video on a whim after finding a copy at my local video game store, so yeah, go to your local video game stores and comic book shops. They're probably going to be pretty cool. But yeah, that's all I got. Thank you very much for watching. Like, subscribe, and all that jazz. I'll catch you guys next time. Later, kids. Have a good night.
Did you see that thing?
Yeah, what is that?
Look, are you getting this? Look!
This doesn't make sense. Oh my god.
How far will you go to save New York?